Now that the singing is done, said Carla, let us to the tables and stuff ourselves. He clapped his huge paws together with a booming laugh and the boys rushed to their seats and began to feast. Myra turned and saw that food had been set out while she had been listening to the song. She hadn't noticed the servers at all. The smell of roasted meat, dripping gravy, freshly picked fruits and 100 other lovely aromas filled Myra's nostrils. Then she noticed something that both worried and amazed her. The boys weren't just drinking water, they were drinking mead and ale. They were laughing merrily now, knocking their wooden flagons together and splashing the contents all over. Myra looked over to Emmett and Carla and saw that they were drinking as well and seemed completely unconcerned. It occurred to Myra that the culture of the Arthurians and that of the outside world had drastically different views when it came to certain things. The outer world sought to protect children and to shield them from things until they were deemed old enough. The Arthurians, on the other hand, were not so gentle with their offspring. Theirs was a warrior society where hard men both flourished and grew. But the old world that the Arthurians had known was gone now. They were leftovers from a bygone age when the world had been less civilized and more violent. Myra wondered how the Arthurians would react to the modern world after being separated for so long. You will see soon enough, the whispering voice in the back of her mind said to her. Suddenly Myra felt the weight of her weariness. Her body ached and her hands throbbed. She sat down heavily on one of the wooden benches and leaned against the table. The world around her seemed to grow faint and distant. She closed her eyes and listened to her heart beating in her ears, feeling her wakefulness slipping away. To her it appeared that she was retreating into her own body and would soon be lost to sleep. Myra did not resist. She wanted, needed and welcomed sleep. She was so very tired. But then someone sat down next to her and clapped her on her shoulder. She was pulled back from the brink and sat up with a start. She saw that it was Daniel who had touched her. He had a mug of something in his hand and he had an overly happy smile on his face. The smell of sweet honey mead was on his breath. I'm a rich man now, Myra. He laughed. I've been given a whole chest full of treasure. Gold, silver, jewels, you name it, I've got it. Daniel, you're drunk, she said as she looked at him with mild contempt. No, I'm not, he said. I'm pretty sure I haven't drunk enough of this stuff for that to have happened yet. He looked down at the ruddy gold liquid that sloshed in his cup and took another long draught. He cringed slightly as he swallowed. It tastes bitter at first, he said, but it's starting to grow on me. Beatrice and Jason are going to kill you when they find out, warned Myra. You know what they think of that stuff. And you're way too young to be drinking it anyway. Give that to me. Myra stood up and made a grab for Daniel's flagon, but he was too quick for her. He leapt to his feet and jumped away from her, holding his cup high over his head. I'll give this to you when I'm done with it, he growled as he took another drink. Myra made another attempt to wrest the flagon away from him, but Daniel, who was ever so slightly taller than her, held it over his head and kept it from her reach. Some of the Arthurian boys saw this and laughed merrily in amusement. Looks like she wants to join in the fun as well, one boy said to his companion. Either that or Daniel's just teasing her, said the other. Let her have a try. The first boy laughed. There's plenty to go around. Myra lunged for the cup, causing Daniel to leap backwards. He caught his heel on a lip in the floor and he fell with a crash, spilling his mug all over himself. When the Arthurians saw this they howled with laughter. Even Carla and Emmett chuckled at the sight. Daniel wiped the liquor from his eyes as he glared up at Myra, his face red. Can you give me a hand up? He asked, stretching out his hand. I can't, she replied, showing her reddened and throbbing hands. Oh, he said, never mind. At that moment Crest, who had been watching their exchange with great amusement, got up from his throne and leapt onto the head table. He then jumped to the other tables and skipped along their tops until he hopped down next to Myra and Daniel. Leave poor Daniel alone, Myra. He laughed as he stooped down to help Daniel to his feet. I will when he promises not to touch any more of that stuff, said Myra, motioning to the casks of mead. Why would you deny him his victory toast? Asked Crest. Because he's too young to drink, that is why, answered Myra. It's against the law to let children under the age of 18 drink. At least it was the law in our country. This is not your country, Myra, said Crest. We do things differently here. I know that, said Myra. It's impossible not to know that in this place. She looked around at the hall as she said this. But Daniel will get into trouble if Beatrice and Jason find out he's been drinking that stuff. That stuff, as you put it, is some of the finest honey mead ever brewed, said Crest. but if it will get my new friend into trouble, then I promise that I won't let him drink any more of it. Thank you, said Myra. Besides, it'll leave more for me. Crest added with a smug grin. Myra made no comment on this. She merely closed her eyes and shook her head. Where's Tilla? Crest suddenly asked. Myra looked at him and replied, she's still out there healing the others. All alone? Asked Crest. I thought she would have been done hours ago. Well, she's still bandaging him up, said Myra with a tired sigh. Huh, mused Crest as he turned away. Thanks for nothing, Myra, grumbled Daniel. I was enjoying myself. You can enjoy yourself in 6 years when you're old enough, replied Myra. Right now just be grateful your parents aren't here to see you. What would they say if they saw you like this? It's bad enough that you were drinking, but what about all the fighting? I'm pretty sure my dad wouldn't be angry with me joining the fur, said Daniel, but I'm dead certain that my mom would be mortified. And she would have good cause to be, said Myra. Look at yourself, you're all covered in knocks and bruises. You look like a rugby player after a match. No, said Daniel, I look like a tackle football player. Rugby players don't wear padding, remember? They don't use wooden swords and shields either, reminded Myra. True, admitted Daniel. Either way, you're a mess, said Myra. I could say the same about you, said Daniel, glancing at her disheveled appearance. You're both dirty, said Asa as he stepped towards them. And tired, said Myra. I'm going to sleep. Well, good night to you, said Daniel. Asa and I will drink a toast on your behalf. Actually, I'm going to bed too, said Asa. Have another for me, will you? Okay, sure, said Daniel, but you'll both be missing out on the fun. I think I've had enough fun for today, said Myra with a yawn. You better not think of having any more of that booze. I promise I won't have any more, Daniel said, crossing his fingers behind his back as he spoke. Myra nodded and turned away. Asa followed her. They left the great hall and went into the living quarters. They had each been given a room. The chambers were directly across from one another and were at the end of a long wooden hallway. Candles lit the passage. The floor was exposed earth, tightly compacted from centuries of traffic. I can't wait to fall asleep, yawned Myra. I haven't felt this tired since my papa made me help him plant Mr. Bogger's backfield 4 years ago. I can't wait to sleep in a real bed again, said Asa. Myra, you have no idea how amazing it is to sleep in one when you've spent your whole life sleeping on a concrete floor. I still don't know how you managed to do that, said Myra as she recalled the abandoned subway station where Asa and his mother had hidden themselves in Empire City. You get used to it, said Asa, but I'm sure happy that I won't be doing any more of that anytime soon. These cots the Arthurians gave us are nice and all, said Myra, but Asa, you should have seen the bed my parents had. It was the biggest, softest and bounciest one I've ever seen. Sounds like heaven, sighed Asa. I remember snuggling up with my parents and sister in that bed when I was younger, mused Myra. Well, I'm going to snuggle up with my blanket now, said Asa as he turned towards his door. Good night, Asa, said Myra. Wait a minute, Myra, said Asa, turning back to face her. Yes, asked Myra. Are we going to go to Nightland tonight? Asked Asa. Nightland was the name that Myra and Asa had given to the dreamscape they shared. It was a world entirely their own. A world where they could do and make anything they wanted merely by wishing for it. Nightland was also a place where they practiced their magic. Yes, answered Myra, I'll be there in a minute. You go and get everything ready. All right, said Asa, I'll see you in a few minutes. Asa stepped into his room and closed the door behind him. Myra turned and entered her own chamber. It was sparsely furnished. One cot sat next to the window. There was a small nightstand next to the bed. A candle burned in the corner, its dim light casting flickering shadows around the room. Myra let out a tired moan. She walked over to the candle and blew it out. The flickering red light was immediately replaced with silver moonbeams streaming in through the window. Myra stepped towards the glass and reached out her hands to close the curtains. But as she was about to pull them together, she looked outside. From where she was, she could see past the wooden walls to the fields beyond. The moon's light cast everything in a silvery light. And what she saw standing in the full moonlight made her catch her breath. The man with burning eyes. Myra could see him more clearly now. He was tall and was wearing a deep cowl that hid his face from view. Along with this hood, he wore a heavy black cloak that went down all the way to his ankles and covered him completely. His feet were lost in the tall grass. He was around 50 yards away, but Myra could see that he was truly there. This was no figment of her imagination. He was looking directly at her. His eyes were still glowing fiery red. Myra stood petrified, her hands gripping the curtains with such force that she ripped them by mistake. She gazed at her stalker and locked eyes with him. "Who are you?" she said aloud. The man made no answer, at least Myra heard no answer. He just stood there and stared at her with his glowing eyes. Then Myra realized that his eyes weren't just glowing like fire, his eyes were truly on fire. Flames licked and danced at the outer corners. Light flickered from them and partly illuminated his face. Myra saw that he was wearing a veil of some sort that covered most of his face, only his eyes and his brows were visible. She gazed at him for what seemed like ages. She could sense his magic, and once again it was overpowering and all-encompassing. She wanted to get away. She wanted to turn around, wake Asa, run back to the Great Hall and tell Carla and Emmett. Then the two chieftains would rush out of the gates, swords drawn, and capture him. But before she could even look away, the man raised up his gloved hand and put his finger to his hidden lips. Then he playfully waved at Myra and turned away, walking through the swaying grasses. To Myra's astonishment, he began to slowly disappear. At first it seemed that he was becoming fuzzy and unfocused, then he appeared to be transparent. Finally his shadow vanished and he was gone. Not a trace of him was left. The grass where he had been walking was unbent. The thick aura of magic disappeared as well. Myra let out a breath that she had been holding. She took several deep breaths and looked at the spot where she had seen him. Nothing at all. Did I really see him? Myra found herself saying out loud. She continued looking through the window, but all she saw was the wooden wall and the moonlit wheat fields beyond. As Myra continued to gaze, she began to tell herself that it had been only her imagination. Asa and Amaron were right all along, she said to reassure herself. I'm so tired that I'm beginning to see things. Yes, that must be it. I'm seeing things. Try as she might, Myra couldn't quite convince herself that she hadn't seen something out there. She could still remember how the man's magic had pressed up against hers. It had felt like someone was trying to force the opposite sides of a magnet together and nearly succeeding. But that magic was gone now and the memory was beginning to fade. Myra once again felt her weariness overcome her. Her eyes were growing heavy. She pulled off her dress and slipped under the coverlets of her cot. When she laid down, she relaxed her body and closed her eyes. I'm coming, Asa, she said in a low whisper. Within a few minutes she was asleep. She found Asa already waiting for her in the dream. Together they shaped and molded the world of the dream to a form of their liking, and once that was done they began practicing their magics. Myra made no mention of the man with burning eyes, and by the time she and Asa had finished shaping Nightland she had almost completely forgotten about him. Meanwhile in the Great Hall the feast was slowly winding down. The boys, now thoroughly into their cups, were beginning to drop off to sleep. A few, however, continued to laugh, sing and dance. Daniel and Eric were sitting on one of the long wooden benches at one of the tables by the fire. The red-haired Arthurian boy was telling Daniel about one of his early adventures, his first cattle raid to be precise, but Daniel was only half listening. When Eric described how he and the others had driven the Kynes back to their own territory, Daniel was looking around for Crest, but he couldn't see him anywhere. He hadn't seen the fur chief since he had promised Myra that he wouldn't let him drink any more of the mead. He turned to Eric and said, "Hey, where'd Crest go?" Eric stopped in mid-sentence and looked around. "You know, I haven't the faintest idea," said the Arthurian boy. He got up from the bench and called for the fur chief, but Crest neither answered nor showed himself. "He's gone," said Eric, dumbfounded. "Has he gone to bed?" asked Daniel. Eric scoffed at this. "This is his victory feast. He wouldn't miss this for anything." "I wouldn't be too sure about that," said a voice. The boys turned and saw Alfgeir standing behind them. It was at this moment that Daniel first noticed that his eyes didn't match. He remembered seeing something about that in one of his sister's medical textbooks. He thought it was called heterochromia or something like that. How on earth did I remember that word? Daniel thought as the Arthurian boy stepped towards him. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I saw him leave," replied Alfgeir. "The moment when Myra told him where Tilla was, he turned around and walked right out of the hall. I was surprised you missed it. You were standing right next to him. He's gone to help Tilla tend to the wounded," said Eric, "but that's healer's work, no job for warriors." "Eric, I've patched up my friends more times than I can count," said Alfgeir. "Just because one fights doesn't mean that one should forsake the knowledge of healing." "Well said," boomed Carla from his seat across the hall. The big Arthurian was gnawing on a roasted chicken leg as he spoke. "You'd do well to listen to Alfgeir." Eric scoffed and waved off the chieftain's advice. "And I don't think it was only for seeing after the sick that he went," continued Alfgeir. "What do you mean?" asked Daniel. Crest was muttering something about Lord Tywin's daughter, and there was a certain look in his eye when he left, said Alfgeir. "If I may be so bold." "Yes?" asked Daniel. "Go on," added Eric. "I think he's fond of her," answered Alfgeir. "We're all fond of her," said Eric. "She has mended our wounds for as long as we were part of the fur. She is a sister to us all." "Indeed," replied Alfgeir, "but I wonder." "Enough of this nonsense," said Eric. "Daniel, yes. Since Crest isn't here, he can't stop you from joining us in another toast." Daniel smiled at this as he refilled his flagon. The night air was growing cold now. Crest waded through the tall grass towards the candlelight glowing in the distance. Within a few minutes he was standing behind her. Tiller was bent over a boy who had had his left arm shattered. He winced and hissed as the Arthurian girl set the bone and splintered it. "Thank you, sister," he said in a pained rasp when she was finished. Tiller nodded at him. "I am thirsty," he added. "Do you have any water left?" "Forgive me, but I've given all mine away to the others before you," Tiller apologized. The boy moaned and licked his dry lips. "You can have a pull of mine," said Crest, stepping into the candlelight. Tiller looked over her shoulder at him in surprise. He knelt down beside her and unhooked his flask off of his belt. Pulling the stopper out, he offered it to the boy. The wounded boy saw Crest's face in the candlelight and scowled ruefully at him. "Get away from me," he snarled. "You may have bested Algar and ended my old fur, but I will never accept charity from your hands." "The old feud is over," said Crest. "Be reasonable. You are thirsty and I am giving you relief from it." "I will not take it," spat the boy. "You will not win my loyalty with bribery." "I am not bribing you," countered Crest. "I am trying to mend the rift between our two fur. We are one fur now. The Heart Lances will rise again one day," the wounded boy declared, "and on that day we shall avenge ourselves upon all those who have wronged us." "Enough," growled Tiller, snatching the canteen from Crest's hands. "Now he is no longer the one offering you drink, I am. Will you accept it from me?" The boy remained silent, but after a moment he nodded. Tiller raised his head and poured a mouthful over his dried lips. The boy swallowed and let out a sigh. "Thank you, my lady," he said with a bow of his head. Tiller returned the nod and rose to her feet. Sova's wings and heart-shaped face flashed white in the moonlight as he alighted on her shoulder. The barn owl chirred softly as she stroked him. "Good hunting?" she asked him. The owl nodded in reply and brushed his head against hers. Tiller giggled and stroked him again. Sova chirred again and flapped silently into the air, disappearing into the darkness. "Enjoy this night's hunting," she called after him, "because it will be the last time in this place." "So you think we are leaving tomorrow?" asked Crest, stepping forward. Tiller turned and gave him an inquisitive look. She examined him for a moment before she answered. "Yes, I think so," she said as she turned away. She walked over to another wounded boy and knelt down next to him. Crest walked up behind her, watching her hands. He was always amazed at how deft and lightly her fingers moved. Her healing skills were undeniable. Once she was finished patching the boy up, she rose and turned to face Crest. "Why are you out here?" she asked him. "Shouldn't you be enjoying your feast? It will be the last one ever held in the sanctuary." "I have already thoroughly enjoyed my supper," he replied. "I wanted to see if you needed any help." "That is kind of you to ask," she replied. "I'm glad to see that someone cares enough to offer help, even if it is several hours late." "Yes, I am sorry about that," he replied sheepishly. "I was too caught up in the celebrations." "Don't apologize to me, Crest," she chuckled. "I honestly didn't think anyone would come out here. Who would want to help the fallen when there is a victory to be celebrated? None of the noble born, that's for certain. But I'm not noble born, remember," Crest replied. "My father may have been an Einherjar, but he only gained that honor because he was among the best of the best. And my mother wove tapestries for—" "My mother," Tiller interrupted. "Yes, I remember. Her needlework is still the best I've ever seen." "Do you remember the first one she made?" asked Crest, "the one showing the story about how we came to be here?" "Yes, I do," Tiller answered. "It was that cloth that made me want to become a storyteller." "Really?" said Crest. "I didn't know that." "Well, it was over 900 years ago," giggled Tiller. "We were only mewling babes then." Maybe you were, said Crest, but I distinctly remember my parents boasting about how I was such a good baby. They said that I never cried more than I had to or kept him up late. Tiller laughed and smiled at him. Of all the things to boast about, she snickered, you chose that. I must say that you always make me laugh, Crest. I try my best, Crest replied with a smug smile. Anyway, I wanted to ask. Suddenly Sova whooshed overhead, shrieking like a fiend from hell. Both Tiller and Crest ducked and looked up at the agitated bird. He was flapping his white and brown wings to hold himself in place. What is it? Cried Tiller. What's wrong? Asked Crest. The owl shrieked and hooted in terror. Then it abruptly turned and flew away as fast as its wings could carry him. Sova disappeared into the gloom. Confused, Crest and Tiller looked at each other. Then they felt it, a dark presence that loomed up out of the shadows. A patch of stars went out and it grew suddenly cold. The two Arthurian youngsters stood closer together. Crest faced in the direction of the darkened sky and drew out his steel sea-axe from its sheath. He placed himself between Tiller and the dark air. Something was out there, watching them. Crest's sea-axe flashed in the moonlight and he held it at the ready. Who's there? He called, his voice sounded braver than he felt. Show yourself. Nothing. The presence made no answer. It silently moved away, the starless patch of sky moving with it. A cold wind whispered through the grass. Something fluttered in the breeze. The youngsters stood rooted to the spot. It's a djinn, Tiller hissed in horror. No, said Crest as he watched it go. This is something else. Something. As they spoke, the presence vanished altogether and stars began to shine once again. Everything went back to normal. There was nothing out there. After a few moments of waiting to see if it would come back, Crest sheathed his knife and turned away. He was panting and sweating. He turned to Tiller and saw that her face was pale with fear. They were both glistening with cold sweat. What was that? She asked. I don't know, replied Crest with a shaky voice, but it was no djinn, I know that for certain. How do you know? She asked. Because it didn't make a sound, Crest answered, djinn never shut up. They're always laughing and cackling when they're awake. If it had been a djinn, it would have gone off on a rant about who it was and why it had come here and how it was going to kill us. How do you know that? She asked. Because I've gone out beyond the walls and encountered djinn, replied Crest. The one I met went on and on with its whole life story and nearly bored me to tears. How did that thing get into the sanctuary? Asked Tiller, looking around nervously. I don't know, answered Crest. Maybe it was nothing. Nothing? Cried Tiller. What are you saying? We both saw it, but we didn't, said Crest. We only saw a patch of starless sky and an ill wind. Maybe we're under the effects of a parting spell from one of the dragon witches. Do you remember the hex they put on the Northern Watch guards 30 years ago? They had them convinced that we were all goblins and that the sanctuary had been completely overrun. I remember, said Tiller. Do you really think that's what it was? Well, we were both close to them when they were here, offered Crest. You threw a cup at Malges and I was near him when Daniel shot his eye out. Maybe that's when we were put under the spell. But then everyone should be affected by the spell, countered Tiller. Not everyone, replied Crest. Myra was much closer to them and she claimed to have seen someone trying to sneak up on her a few minutes ago. She did? Asked Tiller, and there was no one there. Amaron roared a jet of fire earlier but saw nobody. You must have seen and heard him, said Crest. Yes, I heard Amaron screaming something but I couldn't make out what he was saying, said Tiller. He was telling this phantom that Myra was under his protection, said Crest, although the whole show was rather pointless as there was no one there. You're sure that it was just a shadow that we saw? Asked Tiller. I'm sure, he replied. Besides, it didn't feel right. What do you mean, didn't feel right? Said Tiller. I don't know, said Crest. I felt like I was in a bad dream when I saw that darkness. A bad dream, Tiller echoed. Crest nodded. I felt the same way, said Tiller. It didn't feel real, and yet. Well, it's over now, interrupted Crest. The dream is done. How many wounded will you treat before you turn in? Not many, Tiller replied. I sent word to the other healers a few hours ago with Sova. They should be arriving any time to help me. You're not turning in? Asked Crest. Not when I still have yours and Algar's mess to clean up, she replied. You'll be exhausted for tomorrow, Crest noted. This won't be the first night when I stayed awake until dawn, counted Tiller. You remember when you saved me from Algar's clutches, don't you? Yes, chuckled Crest, but as I recall, you nearly fell off Hulda at least 3 times before we were back in my territory. When we were finally safe you fell right to sleep. And as I recall, said Tiller, you were complaining all the while about how poor little Hulda would wake up lame the next morning after carrying the both of us for so long. She's gotten stronger since then, Crest defended. She could carry 3 of us and still have enough strength to leap over the Greenfill River in one bound. I'll believe that when I see it, giggled Tiller. The two continued talking as the moon came out from behind a cloud. It bathed their surroundings in silvery light. If either of them looked up at that moment they would have seen a dark shape dart across the white face of the moon and disappear into the clouds.